Carrick had learned patience from the mountains, and the mountains never lied to him the way people did. He lay in the rocks above the Doruk Road with his rifle balanced on a folded saddle blanket, and he watched the aid truck come around the lower switchback at exactly the minute his radio man had promised. He let it climb. He was a man who enjoyed the climbing part. The driver was young and careful, riding the brake on the loose gravel, and beside him sat a contractor in a blue vest with a clipboard on his knee, a man who had flown into these highlands believing that a clipboard and good intentions were a kind of armor. Carrick shot the front tire first, because he liked to watch the calculations fall apart on a man's face before he took the face away. The truck slewed sideways into the cut bank and stalled. The contractor got the door half open before Carrick's second round found him, and then the screaming started, thin and high in the cold air, carrying up the slope to where Carrick lay smiling with frost in his beard. He had buried 14 of their scouts in this valley over 4 months. 14 in shallow stone graves the dogs sometimes found. He knew the Americans by now the way a trapper knows the animal he hunts, knew that they could not leave a man screaming on a road, that somewhere a radio was already crackling, that within the hour a helicopter would come thudding up the gorge, full of hard young men who believed they were the most dangerous thing in these mountains. They were wrong about that. The most dangerous thing in these mountains was a patient man who had already chosen where they would die. He had wired the high meadow above the wreck with everything he had carried up on mules across 3 nights, and he had registered every range to every rock, and now he settled in to wait for the rescue, because the rescue was the whole point. The contractor was only bait. Carrick checked the sky, found it empty and blue and enormous, and felt, for the first time in a long while, something close to joy. 40 kilometers south, on a freezing flight line at a fire base, the map still called Outpost Calder, the woman who was about to ruin Carrick's afternoon was throwing up quietly behind a fuel bladder so that no one would see her do it. Her name was Reyna Sutton, and she was 29 years old, and she had been throwing up before missions for almost a year now, a fact she had told exactly no one. She wiped her mouth on the back of her glove, rinsed with a mouthful of canteen water, spat into the gravel, and walked back around the bladder with her face composed into the flat, unbothered expression she had been practicing since she was a girl. By the time she reached the bird, she looked like someone who had simply been checking a strap. The team watching her approach did not see any of that. What they saw was a woman who came up to the shoulder of the smallest man among them, carrying a rifle case longer than she was, wearing a borrowed cold-weather parka that swallowed her hands. What they saw was a problem. "That's the Overwatch," Sergeant First Class Dunbar said. He did not bother to lower his voice. "Tell me that's not the Overwatch." Master Sergeant Holt did not answer right away. He had been doing this for 23 years, and one of the things 23 years teaches a man is that the first thing your gut tells you about a person is frequently the thing you will be most embarrassed about later. He had read Sutton's file on the flight in. He had read it twice and parts of it 3 times, and it had not gotten any more believable on the 3rd reading, which was its own kind of information. People with ordinary records do not get sent to outposts like Calder. People with impossible records do. "That's Langley's contribution?" Holt said. "Stand down. She looks like she's lost on the way to a college campus." Dunbar spat. There was real heat in it. The thing the narrator must understand about Dunbar, to be fair to him, is that his anger was not entirely about the woman. It was about the math. The job in front of them was a hostage recovery deep in country with a high probability of contact, and a man who has buried his friends learns to hate any variable he cannot trust. Sutton was to Dunbar a variable. He did not yet know that she was the only reason any of them would walk out of the Doruk Valley alive. In the briefing tent, she sat in the back corner with the rifle case across her knees and her hands resting on it the way another person might rest their hands on a sleeping dog. The team filled the front benches, 6 men who had bled together for 3 deployments and moved like the separate hands of one body. They had a shorthand of glances and grunts she was not part of, and they let her feel it. When the intelligence officer brought up the imagery of the Highland village, where the scout element had last reported, Dunbar twisted around on his bench to look at her. "You ever take a shot at someone that shoots back, Sergeant?" Sutton met his eyes. She did not flinch and she did not bristle. The narrator, watching her, would later describe the look on her face as the particular stillness of a person who has been asked this exact question many times by many men and has stopped finding it interesting. "No, Sergeant," she said, But the math doesn't change because the target's nervous. A couple of the men laughed before they could stop themselves. Dunbar didn't. What's your confirmed long shot? Range time doesn't count. Real distance, real conditions. 2,400 yards. She said it the way other people say their birthday. A wolf that had been pulling calves on my grandfather's lease. Wind was switching off the Absarokas. It took me 40 minutes to get the call right. A wolf, Dunbar said. It didn't know I was there. People know you're there. She looked down at the case, then back up. I'm aware of the difference, Sergeant. I think about it more than you'd guess. Holt was watching this the way a man watches weather coming, and he made a decision he would spend the rest of the deployment being glad about. He decided to wait and see before he made up his mind, which is a harder thing to do than most people admit, because the human animal wants its verdict early and wants to defend it. What none of them knew, sitting in that tent, was where she had come from. The narrator will tell it plainly, because it matters to everything that follows. Reyna Sutton had been raised by her grandfather on a hard-luck cattle lease in southern Montana after her parents proved themselves unequal to the work of raising her. Cyrus Sutton was a man of few soft edges and one great gift, which was an almost supernatural ability to read moving air. He had been a competitive long-range shooter in his youth, back when that meant iron sights and hand-loaded brass and a tolerance for being cold and bored that most modern men have lost. He built rifles in a shed that smelled of solvent and wood smoke, and he built one for Reyna when she was 11. A long, heavy thing chambered in a Wildcat cartridge of his own design, and he taught her that the rifle was the least important part of the shot. The wind was the shot. The wind, and the light bending over hot ground, and the way grass lay down, and the patience to read all of it and believe what it told you, even when it told you something inconvenient. By the time she was 16, she could call a switching crosswind across a mile of prairie and put a single round through a coyote's chest while it trotted. By the time she was 19, she had buried him, and the last thing he asked of her was that she not waste what he had given her. Don't let it sit in a safe, he'd said, his voice a rasp by then. A gift you don't use is just a regret with a serial number. She had carried that sentence into a recruiter's office 2 weeks after the funeral, and she had been trying to honor it and survive it ever since. The wheels up came in the gray hour before dawn. The flight up the gorge was long and rough, the helicopter clawing for altitude and air, gone thin and brutally cold, and Sutton sat with her case strapped between her boots and her eyes closed, and the men assumed she was scared. She was not scared. She was doing what her grandfather had taught her to do before every shot, which was to empty herself out so completely that there would be room for the wind to come in and tell her things. It looked, from the outside, exactly like fear. The narrator notes this because it is one of the quiet tragedies of people like Sutton. The thing that makes them extraordinary is so often mistaken for the thing that makes them weak. They put down on a saddle of bare rock 2 ridgelines south of the wreck, and the trap Carrick had built began, immediately and exactly, to close. The recovery itself does not need a long telling. They found 2 surviving scouts pinned in a goat shelter, both of them hit, one of them badly. And they found out within 90 seconds that the high ground above the road belonged to a marksman who had clearly owned it for a long time. Esquibel took a round through the meat of his shoulder, reaching for a casualty, and the team went flat behind a stone sheepfold, while fire walked along the wall above their heads with a patience that told Holt everything he needed to know. This was not a kid spraying a rifle. This was a craftsman. He's got us, Holt said into the radio, calm because panic is a luxury team leaders cannot afford. He's dialed the whole bowl. Anybody moves in the open, he's got the time of flight already worked out. Where? Dunbar said. Nobody could find him. He'd built his hide into the scree where the rock and the shadow did the work for him, and 3 pairs of the best eyes in the regiment glassed the slope and came up empty. They were going to die in that sheepfold, one well-spaced shot at a time, while a man 2,000 yards uphill enjoyed himself. Sutton had gone very still against the back wall, with her rifle already out of the case and resting across a flat stone. She was not looking through her scope. She was watching the slope with her naked eye, watching the way a column of disturbed snow drifted off a particular shelf of rock, watching a thread of wood smoke that should not have been there bend in a way that told her the wind was doing one thing low and the opposite thing higher up. The narrator wants to be precise about what happened next, because afterward it would become a legend, and legends sand the texture off the truth. She did not see Carrick. No one saw Carrick, What she saw was the disturbance a hidden man makes in a world he thinks he is reading better than anyone. She saw a smear of breath fog rise once, off the same dark seam in the rock, and vanish. "Sergeant Holt," she said quietly, 2,200 yards. The dark seam under the lightning-split rock, about a hand's width left of the dead juniper. He exhales when he settles behind the gun. "I need 8 seconds of nobody shooting so the dust settles." Dunbar looked at her like she'd announced she could fly. "That's 2,200 uphill in switching wind. You can't even see him." "I'm not shooting at him," she said. "I'm shooting at where he has to be." And then, almost to herself, in a voice that had her dead grandfather all through it, "The mountain already told me. I'm just doing the arithmetic." What happened in the next 40 seconds is the reason men who were there still get quiet when it comes up. She dialed her elevation, made a wind call no one else in the regiment would have dared to make. A call that accounted for one wind near the floor of the bowl, and a different, faster wind-up where the round would spend most of its flight. And she breathed out, and she waited for the bottom of her breath. And she pressed the trigger so softly that Dunbar, watching, never saw her hand move. The round was in the air for nearly 3 full seconds. It crossed 2,200 yards of freezing mountain air, climbing and then falling, pushed and then steadied, and it arrived in the dark seam beneath the lightning-split rock at the precise instant Carrick, who had heard nothing, lifted his head to find a target. The slope went silent. For a long moment, nobody in the sheepfold spoke. Then Esquibel, white-faced and bleeding, started laughing, the high, helpless laugh of a man who has just watched the impossible happen on his behalf. Holt let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for a year. And Dunbar turned and looked at the small woman behind the rock as she worked the bolt and laid the spent casing carefully in her pocket, the way her grandfather had taught her. Never leave your brass for the enemy to learn from. And he did not say anything at all, because for the first time in a very long time, Sergeant First Class Dunbar had nothing to say. They got everyone out. The scout who'd been hit badly lived because they got him out. On the helicopter back, with the wounded packed in and the rotor noise making conversation impossible, Dunbar leaned across the bay until his mouth was close to Sutton's ear. "I owe you an apology," he said. It cost him something to say it, and she could see that it did. "I was wrong about you. That was the finest shooting I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot. I'm sorry for what I said." She nodded. She didn't make it easy for him, and she didn't make it hard. "My grandfather taught me," she said. "He'd have liked you. He didn't trust anybody who trusted too fast either." Dunbar almost smiled. From that day forward, he was hers, completely. And the narrator notes that the men who doubt you the longest, and then change their minds, make the most loyal friends you will ever have, because they did not arrive at their loyalty by being soft. They had to be argued out of their certainty by the evidence, and once they were, nothing could argue them back. The thing that happened next is the part the storytellers usually leave out, and it is the part that matters most. Sutton did not come home from the Daruk Valley a hero who'd been validated and was now whole. She came home and she could not sleep. The vomiting before missions got worse. She started losing the thread in conversations, finding herself 30 seconds later with no memory of what had been said. Her hands, the hands that could hold a rifle steadier than a vice, developed a fine tremor when she wasn't paying attention to them, and she had to start holding her coffee cup with both of them. She had done a thing in that valley that she would never describe to anyone, which was that in the half second after her shot landed, she had felt nothing at all, a clean white, nothing where a feeling should have been, and the nothing had frightened her far more than fear ever had. The base behavioral health officer was a woman named Dr. Atchison, who had spent a career learning to read the particular ways that strong people fall apart, which is always quietly and always last. She caught Sutton not through any test, but because she happened to be in the chow hall when Sutton's tray slid off the rail and shattered, and she watched the way Sutton stood frozen over the broken dishes for 3 full seconds, too long before she knelt to pick them up. Atchison said nothing then. She just started finding reasons to be where Sutton was. It took her 4 weeks to get the door open. When it finally opened, what came out was not what command expected and not what Sutton expected either. She was not broken. That was the first thing Atchison said to Holt, in a conversation Sutton was not in the room for. "She's showing severe stress, real burnout, the early shape of it. But this isn't a fragile person coming apart. This is an extraordinarily strong person who has been carrying too much alone for too long, and there's a difference. And the difference is everything. Carry her right, and she keeps doing the impossible for 20 years. Carry her wrong, and you'll break the best shooter you'll ever have, and it'll be your fault, not hers. The man who wanted to carry her wrong arrived 10 days later in a civilian coat that had no business in those mountains. His name was Pell, and he was from one of the three-letter agencies, and he had read the after-action report on the Doruk Valley the way a prospector reads an assay. He looked at Reyna Sutton, and he did not see a person. He saw a capability. He had a list of problems across a wide and ugly region, problems that all had the same solution, which was a single round delivered from a distance no one believed was possible. And he had come to Outpost Calder to collect his solution and put it to work. He wanted her flown to 4 different countries in the next 6 weeks. He had the authority to make it happen, and he had the particular smiling confidence of a man who has never once in his life had to live with the recoil of his own decisions. He explained all of this to Holt and Sutton in the operations tent, laying out the missions like a man dealing cards, and the narrator wants to be exact about Sutton's face during this, because it tells you who she had become. She did not look afraid. She looked far away. She had gone somewhere inside herself where the white nothing lived, and Holt, watching her, recognized it because he had been to that country himself a long time ago and had nearly not come back. "No," Holt said. Pell blinked. "I don't think you understand the authorities I'm operating under. I understand them fine." Holt stood. He was not a large man, but he had a way of filling a space when it mattered. "Sergeant Sutton is a member of my team, and she is not a rifle you check out of an armory. She's at the edge of something Dr. Atchison can put a clinical name to, and I'm not going to be the man who pushed her over it so you could shorten a problem set. You want her, you go through me, and you're not going through me. I can have you replaced," Pell said. "You can try," Holt said pleasantly. "But here's the thing you keep getting wrong about people like her. You think the shot comes from the rifle. It doesn't. It comes from a person who's still whole enough to read the wind and believe what it tells her. Break the person and you don't get the shot. You just get a broken person and a story about how you used to have something special. I've watched men like you do it before. I'm not watching it again." Pell left 2 days later with nothing, and Sutton, who had said not one word during the entire confrontation, found Holt afterward by the fuel bladders, in the cold, near the place where she still went to be sick before the hard days. She didn't know how to thank him for what he'd done, so she said the only true thing she could find. "Nobody's ever stood between me and the thing they wanted from me before," she said. "My whole life it's been, you have this gift, so here's what you owe everybody who doesn't have it." Her voice did something it almost never did, which was crack. "I thought that was just what I was for." "You're not for anything," Holt said. "You're a person who happens to be able to do a thing. That's not the same as being the thing. Took me about 15 years to learn the difference. You don't have to take that long." He looked at her, and the narrator notes that he chose his next words with the care of a man who knows that some sentences land in a person and stay there for the rest of their life. "Asking for help isn't the part where you fail, Sutton. It's the part where you don't." She started seeing Dr. Atchison 3 times a week. She told her about the white nothing. She told her about the vomiting and the tremor and the promise she'd made a dying man in a hospice room that smelled of lilies and disinfectant. Slowly, the way these things actually go, which is never in a straight line, she got a little better. Not fixed. Better. The vomiting eased. She learned to feel the white nothing coming and to name it out loud to someone instead of letting it swallow her. The team, who had absorbed all of this with the rough tenderness that hard men reserve for their own, started doing small things without being asked. Nakamura always saved her the seat against the wall. Pruitt, who never spoke, started leaving a particular kind of hard candy on her gear before missions because he'd noticed she liked it. They never made a thing of it. That was the kindness. They never once made her feel like the broken one. They made her feel like one of them who happened to be carrying something heavy right now. The way each of them had carried something heavy in his turn. The way the whole arrangement only works at all. The valley was not done with them, though. It rarely is. It came in the gray hour again, the way the bad ones always seem to. A frantic call up the chain that turned the whole base into a kicked anthill. Carrick's people, leaderless but not toothless after his death, had taken something they should never have been able to take. A column of Highland families had been moving down out of the snow line toward the relief station at the valley mouth, 200 souls, most of them women and children, and the old, fleeing the fighting in the upper passes. Carrick's surviving lieutenants had cut the column at the one place it had to cross, an old stone footbridge over a gorge 200 feet deep, and they had wired the bridge with the explosives their dead commander had taught them to love. They were holding the families on the near side at gunpoint, and they had run a hard line across the gorge to a detonator held by a single man on the far rim. A man dug into rock at a range that made him untouchable, and they were broadcasting their demands on an open channel for the whole world to hear. If anyone approached, the man on the far rim would put the families on the bridge and drop the bridge into the gorge. There was a captured aid nurse with them, an American named Iverson, who'd refused to leave the column, and it was her voice, steady and exhausted, that came over the relay describing the scene to the rescue force as it staged on a ridge above the crossing. There were 40-some children down there. The youngest was 4. Holt's team made the high ridge as the sun came up, hard and white off the snow, and they understood the trap inside of a minute, because it was Carrick's trap, the same elegant cruelty refined by his students. The man with the detonator was 900 feet across the gorge, and slightly below them, tucked into a notch of rock with only his head and the hand holding the dead man's switch exposed. The narrator must be honest about the distance. He was by Esquibel's laser, 2,410 yards out, across a gorge where the wind did not behave like wind anywhere else on Earth, where cold air poured down off the snowfields and warm air rose off the sunlit rock, and the two of them braided together over the void into something no ballistic computer in the world could fully solve. "There's no shot," Dunbar said quietly, and he was not arguing. He was grieving in advance the way professionals do. Even for her, there's no shot. That wind's doing 4 different things between here and there. He's holding a dead man's switch, Holt said. She drops him. His thumb comes off it. The bridge goes anyway. The kids are on it. "Then there's no shot," Dunbar said again. Sutton was already prone. She had heard all of it and none of it. She was watching the gorge, and the narrator wants to slow down here, because everything she had ever been led to this single ribbon of time. She watched the snow stream off the high cornices and read the cold wind by it. She watched a hawk ride the warm updraft off the sunlit wall and read the rising air by the way its wingtips trembled. She watched a thread of someone's cookfire smoke far below the bridge fold over on itself, and she felt, behind her sternum, the thing her grandfather had spent his whole hard life trying to give her, the thing that was not a skill at all but a kind of listening. The mountain was talking. It always was. Most people just never learned the language. "It's not the man," she said. Her voice was so calm it frightened Holt more than screaming would have. "If I take the man, the switch releases, the bridge goes. So I don't take the man," she breathed out slow. "He's resting that detonator on a flat shelf of rock. It's the only flat place in that whole notch. There's a propane bottle wedged behind him for a stove. I can see the regulator. If I put an incendiary into that bottle, the blast knocks him forward off the shelf, and the detonator goes into the gorge with his hands still wrapped around it, 200 feet down, where it can't trigger the charges on the bridge. It's not a kill shot. It's a physics shot. That's insane," Pell would have said if Pell had been there. But Pell was gone, because Holt had sent him away, and so the only voice that answered was Holt's, and what Holt said was, "Can you make it?" And Sutton, the rookie they had laughed at, the variable Dunbar couldn't trust, the broken woman who threw up behind fuel bladders and held her coffee with both hands. The girl raised by a dying old man on a hard Montana lease, who had made her promise not to waste the one gift he had to give, said the truest and bravest sentence of her life. "I don't know," she said, "but the wind just told me how, and I've decided to believe it." She loaded a single incendiary round. She dialed an elevation that would have looked, to anyone reading it off her scope, like a mistake. She made a wind call that braided 3 separate winds into one number, low and cold, middle and rising, high and screaming. And she held a fraction of the way up the far wall into nothing, into a patch of empty blue sky, where the wind would deliver the round if she had listened correctly and would deliver only failure if she had not. She emptied herself out completely. There was room, suddenly, for everything. Her grandfather's hands over hers on a cold morning 20 years gone. The white nothing, which she let come and let pass. Holt's voice sang the part where you don't fail. 40 children on a stone bridge over 200 feet of empty air. She found the bottom of her breath, and she pressed. The round was in the air for 3.5 seconds. It rose off the muzzle into the cold pour of air coming down the gorge and was pushed, exactly as much as she had asked it to be pushed, and then it climbed into the rising warm wind off the sunlit wall and was lifted. exactly as much, and at the top of its long arc, it crossed the screaming high wind and was steadied by it because she had aimed into the place the wind would be and not the place the target was. And it began to fall, and it fell the way water finds the low ground, certain and unhurried and ordained, 2,410 yards across a gorge that no shot had any business crossing, and it struck the propane bottle, wedged in the rock behind a man who never heard it coming. The far rim bloomed orange. The blast threw the man forward off his shelf, and the detonator went out into the gorge in his fist, falling and falling into the deep cold shadow, and it never reached anything it could harm. On the near side, the holding force scattered in confusion, and the team poured down off the ridge into the gap that confusion opened. And Iverson, the nurse, got the first child off the bridge, and then the second, and then they were all moving, 200 souls flowing off that condemned span of stone to solid ground. The old and the women and 40-some children, the youngest of them 4 years old, all of them walking off a bridge that had been one twitch of a dead man's thumb from the bottom of the gorge. Sutton did not watch them cross. She had already rolled onto her back in the snow, the rifle across her chest, her eyes on the enormous white sky, and she was shaking, and she was letting herself shake, which was the thing Dr. Atchison had taught her. You don't have to hold it in. Holding it in is what breaks you. Holt found her there a few minutes later and sat down in the snow beside her without a word, the way you sit with someone, not to fix them, but just so they are not alone in it. After a while, she spoke. He used to say a gift you don't use is just a regret with a serial number. Her voice was thick. I always thought that meant I owed it to everybody, that it was a debt I was born already owing. She turned her head and looked at the man who had stood between her and the people who only wanted to spend her. I think I finally get what he actually meant. He didn't mean I owed it. He meant don't be afraid of it. Don't lock the best part of yourself in a safe because it scares you. Smart man, Holt said. He'd have liked all of you, she said. Even Pell, probably. He'd have shot at his feet to make him dance, but he'd have liked him. Holt laughed, and after a moment, lying in the snow, with her hands finally still, Reyna Sutton laughed too, and it was the first time anyone on that team had ever heard her do it. She did not become whole that day, because that is not how it works, and the narrator has tried all the way through to tell the truth about how it works. She got better slowly, in a crooked line, with help she had learned to ask for. She kept seeing Dr. Atchison. She kept the seat against the wall that Nakamura always saved her. She kept her grandfather's rifle clean, and she kept his promise the new way she understood it now, which was not as a debt to be paid down to nothing, but as a thing she had finally chosen for herself, freely, with her eyes open. The men who had laughed at her on a cold flight line learned to trust her with their lives, and more than that, they learned to look after her the way she looked after them, because that, in the end, was the only thing any of it was ever for. Not the records. Not the impossible shots that would be told and retold until they stopped sounding true. Just people deciding, again and again, in the cold and the fear, to carry each other across the bridge.